Potential candidates enrolled in the Co-op 21 pre-employment program begin the earliest phases of their coursework during the 12-week deep immersion training intensive known as the kindergarten, because the primary lessons emerging from these mental boot camps have been very intentionally designed to lay a firm foundation for the long-term inner healing process that begins by completely removing potential candidates from the highly stressful, toxic influences permeating their primary home environments, in order to become completely immersed in the diametrically opposite therapeutic influences prevailing over the culture of kindness, energizing every phase of the coursework while building up the basic remedial skill base that has been found to be so urgently needed in light of the recent Houston Chronicle report claiming the American economy loses $225 billion a year because the problem of illiteracy adversely affects the 21st century workplace in every area of operation. While the highly respected New England Journal of Medicine refers to the adult literacy crisis as the silent epidemic, because study after study reveals the inability to read costs the American healthcare system an additional $73 billion due to the fact that 50 million American adults are unable to understand the basic instruction labels on an ordinary prescription bottle. Now, the modern English term for education comes from the ancient Latin educere, that basically means to bring up and lead out, in the exact same way that concisely reflects Plato's most well-known philosophical axiom, claiming all seeking and learning are in fact nothing more than recollection. While the most famous description of this notion was preserved in the legendary account of Minos Slay that has Socrates posing an extremely difficult math problem to a completely illiterate slave boy who never learned to read or write. But after skillfully guiding this young student through a step-by-step series of leading questions ending with the correct answer, the wisest teacher of ancient philosophers eventually went on to claim the young man's inborn ability to solve the problem clearly demonstrated the carefully planned line of questioning simply stirred up the deeply buried memories that had been there all along. Which may also explain why modern English dictionaries currently describe the learning process in terms of a new idea becoming study, or rather made steady and fixed after it becomes completely absorbed into the subconscious memory bank that was traditionally symbolized as a well. And as a matter of fact, the modern term for memory actually came from the name of the mythical giant that guarded the well of wisdom, standing beneath the world tree whose deepest roots reached down throughout all the 9 worlds of ancient Norse mythology. While it also just so happens, this remotely ancient worldview still exerts a powerful influence down to this very day, through the highly acclaimed body of research attributed to the internationally famous descendant of the ancient Norsemen, who is generally considered to be the primary founder of modern analytic psychology. Because 4 long decades of face-to-face clinical experience finally led Carl Jung to compare the various levels of the subconscious mind with the closely interconnected root system of a growing tree, whereby the life-giving emotional heart center of each and every living creature appears to be closely bound and tied in together at a deeply hidden 4th dimensional level where the ordinary rules of time and space do not apply. Now, the fascinating New York Times article on the left describes the historic world record-setting demonstration that took place in the direct presence of 6,000 on-site attendees, along with the massive television audience that viewed the live broadcast from early morning daybreak until the mid-Sunday afternoon of November 16, 2014, while a highly gifted 24-year-old devotee from the Jain religious tradition sat cross-legged on a centrally located stage in the massive Sardar Patel Stadium in Mumbai, India, while 500 previously selected audience members lined up to display random objects, pose mathematical problems, or repeat phrases from one of at least 6 foreign languages.
शब्दों में समाविष्ट हो जाना चाहिए। ब्लॉक नंबर 1 से शुरुआत करेंगे। जिनको भी क्वेश्चन पूछना है वो अपना हाथ ऊपर करेंगे।
जिंदगी में शांति कैसे मिलेगी?
दिलीप वत्से पाटिल साहब, उनसे गुजारिश करूंगा कि आपकी ओर से दूसरा क्वेश्चन पूछा जाए।
देश को शांति और समृद्धि की तरफ ले जाने के लिए कौन सा तरीका अपनाना चाहिए?
ऋषभदेव स्वामीનો જન્મ ક્યાં થયો હતો?
અવસરપણી કાળમાં કેટલા આરા હોય છે?
અવસરપીણી કાળમાં કેટલા આરા હોય છે?
શ્રીમદ રાજચંદ્રજીનો જન્મ કયા ગામમાં થયો હતો?
And so it went on until the last item was finally described after 6 grueling hours of non-stop questioning, at which time the amazing young disciple opened his eyes and calmly answered each and every memory challenge, one of which even included the astonishing calculation that correctly tallied the exact number of marbles one of the questioners had dropped by accurately recalling the precise sound they made while hitting the ground. Now, at least one of the honored guests, among the wide array of highly distinguished dignitaries scattered throughout the audience, was not the least bit surprised by the young disciple's remarkable performance, because the former chairman of the National Jain Doctors Federation was also the widely respected director of the Department of Neurology at the Municipal Medical College in the city of Ahmedabad. And so, Dr. Sudhir Shah chose to open his dramatic keynote address by declaring, "We have witnessed a rare feat in neuroscience today, because the human brain can hold 90 million books, each of 1,000 pages. However, we hardly ever use this perfectly natural gift." Now, over the course of recent decades, a slow but very sure emerging scientific consensus has begun to claim the vast majority of cognitive processes operate at a deeply hidden, unseen level, far below the counterintuitive, logic-driven province of the cranial brain. While it also just so happens the vast majority of ancient cultures base their entire worldview on the notion that the most important phases of the thinking process operate inside the central web of all life that rules over the digestive, adrenal, and cardiac functions, in addition to the creative levels of intuitive abstract thought, most commonly referred to as the gut instinct. Now, according to the highly respected early 20th century research work of Byron Robinson, the abdominal brain can live without the cranial brain, which has been demonstrated by living children being born without a cerebrospinal axis. On the contrary, the cranial brain cannot live without the abdominal brain. So at the end of the day, the rapidly emerging new school view currently envisions the mind and body system as a living and breathing power plant that has been entirely built up around the tightly interconnected heart, brain, and digestive network that interact so closely together, neither component can reasonably be regarded as being functionally separate from or senior to the others. Now, this dramatic shift in just exactly who does what especially applies in regard to the cranial brain center that is currently being described in terms of a computer chat room, where the entire system's vitally important information flow is constantly being refined and reshared, rather than as the primary command and control center that it was considered to be in the past. For long years, before the pandemic spread of the coronavirus shook the international economy down to its very core, the primary founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum boldly predicted the entire economic order was about to be fundamentally transformed by the paradigm-shifting emergence of a fourth industrial revolution that was expected to eliminate as many as 75 million jobs before the end of 2022. However, on the other hand, 133 million new positions were also expected to quickly replace these vacancies because, for example, software developer jobs are currently growing 4 times faster than most old economy positions, creating an open market demand that would typically translate into median incomes running well over $100,000 a year. Therefore, for the very first time in history, the decision-making management class faces the daunting challenge of having to completely retrain the entire global workforce because the best-paying positions of the oncoming industrial revolution will require unique combinations of technical training and highly developed problem-solving skills the vast majority of working-age adults have never heard of. Therefore, the multi-layered cross-training regimen making up Co-op 21's deep immersion coursework has been entirely oriented toward preparing future employment candidates for the extraordinary demands of the new 21st century workplace environment, beginning with the high priority emphasis on an introductory STEM skill set that goes along hand in hand with the equally important soft skills, problem solving, critical thinking, and team building component that has been specifically designed to build up an emotionally contagious environment of cooperative whole body group learning, where the basic notion of one idea sparking another underlies every phase of every single training session, as opposed to the individualistic, competition-based, hierarchical pecking orders making up most traditional training models. The final full promise of the emerging movement toward whole body cooperative learning appears to have been fully anticipated by the vitally important trailblazing efforts of the late Georgi Lazonov, the medically trained Bulgarian trailblazer, whose astonishingly successful teaching methods were specifically designed to fully engage the apparently unlimited potential of the subconscious mind that he so consistently referred to as reserved capacities. Georgi Lazonov's desuggestive learning model combined the beauty of art, music, and role play in order to create the multi-sensory overflow that allows the human brain to soak up massive amounts of new information in the very same way a dry sponge soaks up water.
Dr. Bruner, it's Charlie Babbitt.
Where are you, son?
It's not important. What matters is who I'm with.
You have to bring him back, Mr. Babbitt. Do you understand me?
There's no problem whatsoever. It'll be $1.5 million. I'm not greedy. I just want my half. Raymond, don't touch that. It's dirty.
I can't do that, Mr. Babbitt. You know I can't. Just bring him back and bring him back now. This is where he belongs.
No, I'm his brother. It's not like kidnapping here, is it?
He's always been a voluntary patient here, but that's beside the point. The fact of the matter is, this is where he can get the best care. We're talking about his well-being.
Yeah. Let's just cut through the bullshit, okay? Now, I am entitled to part of my father's estate. If you don't want to cut a deal with me, I'll fly him back to Los Angeles. We'll stick him in an institution out there, and we can have a custody battle over him. Miss, he needs toothpicks. Could you help him and get him some toothpicks? Thank you very much. Now, you want to battle me in the courts? Think about that. Dr. Bruner, think about that. Or we can cut a deal right now.
I don't think you have any idea of the severity of Raymond's condition.
Look, toothpicks. He needs some toothpicks. Can we just get him some toothpicks over here?
Can I
Then I'll see you in court. Okay, check. Sorry about the toothpicks.
82, 82, 82.
82 what, Ray? How much is this?
Toothpicks.
It's a lot more than 82 toothpicks, Ray.
Plus 246 total.
The change. Ray, how many toothpicks are you?
250.
Pretty close. Come on, let's go, Ray.
246.
There's 4 left in the box.
The extraordinary range of memory power exhibited by the highly gifted savant in the Academy Award-winning Best Picture of 1988, as well as modern India's legendary master of memory, was also considered to be the most vitally important element in Dr. Lozanov's highly effective learning technique that was entirely based on the human mind's perfectly natural inborn ability to fully absorb huge amounts of subconsciously suggested peripheral information. And, as can be seen on the screen, page 31 from Dr. Lozanov's most popular training manual clearly displays 4 columns listing the abbreviated names, age, and daily occupations of the adult participants from one of the earliest experimental attempts at suggestopedic learning, while the 4th column, farthest to the right, displays the final results of a written test on the 1,000 new French words that were introduced during the initial opening session, which clearly shows the lowest score listing out as 90%, while 8 out of the 15 participants remembered the entire lesson in a way that ultimately caused the collective scores of Dr. Lozanov's very first suggestopedic class to average out at 98.8. Now, the quintessential key difference separating the desuggestive model from traditional learning appears to lie in the very intentional generation of the profound emotional joy and deep inner happiness that represents the critically important key ingredient needed for the technique to properly work on the consistently reliable basis described in the 6th chapter of the manual. Under suggestopedic conditions, joy springs not so much from the pleasant outward organization of the educational process, but rather from the easy assimilation of the material, as well as the easy way it can be used in practice. Now, while the most important key element for opening up the deepest levels of the mind-body learning system turned out to be emotion, a secondary, but by no means less important necessary element, called for consistently creating the psychologically nurturing state of pronounced emotional engagement that allows students to fully access the mind-expanded state of intentionally provoked hyper-creativity, whereby, as Dr. Lozanov explained, intuition is activated and states similar to inspiration arise. These are outwardly expressed through decidedly greater creative expressions of the personality. A number of experiments have documented the sudden manifestation of artistic gifts and extraordinary mathematical abilities. While it also just so happens the entirely spontaneous manifestation of mental gifts Dr. Lozanov referred to as reserved capacities precisely resemble the extraordinary talents commonly found among the most notable cases of savant syndrome, such as Lawrence Kim Peek, the lifetime Salt Lake City resident whose astonishing ability to accurately recall the precise contents of nearly 12,000 books inspired screenwriter Barry Morrow to create the legendary character portrayed by Dustin Hoffman in his Academy Award-winning performance as the Rain Man. Now, it also just so happens that over the course of 2015, nearly half a dozen scientific journals published articles describing a fascinating research project that had scientists from the University of Texas and the Salk Institute working together on a historic team effort whose final results ultimately led to the amazing discovery that the individual human brain potentially exhibits the capacity to store an entire petabyte of information, which is an absolutely astonishing quantity that closely approximates the entire content of the World Wide Web. So given the tremendous implications of this amazing discovery, it would not be the least bit unreasonable to compare the human memory system to the highly interactive cloud computing and data storage system that concisely embodies Carl Jung's depiction of the earthbound persona, whose life-giving information flow indirectly blossoms forth from the deepest depths of the collective unconscious through intuition, dreams, and coincidence, but can also be directly accessed by traditional mental training methods or by means of the islands of genius, spontaneously appearing among the nearly 1 in 10 persons with autistic disorder who consistently exhibit these remarkable abilities in varying degrees. Now, remarkably similar tradition, sharing the exact same highly advanced concepts described in Carl Jung's famous model of the human psyche, has been ingeniously preserved in the hidden system of sacred root words scattered throughout the prehistoric language of ancient Hawaii that also appears to be closely related to the earliest dialects of Nile Valley, Egypt. Because it can clearly be seen on the far left side of the screen, the third definition given for the small intestines in the Lauren Andrews Dictionary of the Hawaiian Language closely associates the affections, the mind, the internal moral nature, and the heart all together into the tightly interconnected single unit that ultimately identifies the soul as the seat of the moral powers. Now, interestingly enough, when this very same term was combined with the ancient Hawaiian word for cloud, that also means light and day, we're given a description of a wise and knowing mind that has become enlightened, as if to imply the life-giving light, making the mind wise, literally flows down from the heavenly places of many prayers and ancestors who lived among the clouds. In the exact same way, the very same idea was depicted in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph that represented the clouds in the sky, as well as the word shine. While at a much later point in history, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers both held to the notion of a personal inner genius, otherwise known as the first mind, who inspires the earthbound ego in order to cultivate the highest expressions of its potential talents and gifts. Now, one of the most popular forms they used to represent this infinitely wiser level of the inner mind was a beautiful golden figurine that could only be fully appreciated after its owner cracked away the outer layers of cheap pottery made up from the superstitious half-truths and false belief systems every soul adheres to over the earliest phases of long-term inner growth. Now, the third and fourth overlapping components of the Co-op 21 pre-employment program have primarily been designed around the first 100 hours of deep immersion coursework that will be roughly modeled after the extended series of historic research conducted at the University of Wisconsin over the earliest course of the 2000s, after mounting scientific evidence began to suggest the interconnected structural patterns of the adult brain continue to remain completely malleable and plastic, as opposed to becoming fixed and impervious to change immediately after the earliest childhood years, as had been previously believed. which ultimately led research to conclude proper exposure to the right types of mental training might enable individuals who are predisposed towards self-destructive, antisocial behaviors to alter their mental floor plans and reorient their emotional response patterns towards healthier and happier outcomes. As things turned out, an extraordinary chain reaction of chance coincidences ultimately led the Dalai Lama of Tibet to vigorously encourage a specially selected group among the planet's most accomplished meditation practitioners to work closely with a highly trained team of brilliant neuroscientists at the University of Wisconsin's internationally renowned Brain Research Laboratory in order to participate in the deepest exploration of the human mind that had ever been attempted up to that point. Now, every one of the research subjects turned out to be highly accomplished practitioners who all had at least 15,000 hours of experience under their belts, while the oldest participant, who had meditated every day for the last 40 years, was estimated to have brought at least 50,000 hours of contemplative practice to the table. And, as things finally turned out, the very first discovery to attract the team's attention would be the extraordinary powerful electrical pattern known as gamma synchrony, because the pronounced presence of these ultra-high frequency waves represented a surefire indication of the ultra-high speed process that synchronizes far-flung areas of the brain into the exact type of precise lockstep precision exhibited by the highly talented double Dutch champions who continuously weave a constant state of ongoing motion into their precisely coordinated routines over exceptionally long periods of time. While, as can clearly be seen from the graphs reading out over the top row, the highest levels of gamma synchrony produced by the undergraduate research control group were unable to reach anywhere near the average ranges produced by the long-time meditators. But it would be the internationally famous project participant pictured to the right who finally produced the extraordinary levels displayed in the third bar that stand out in such a dramatic way high above all the others. Now, Mathieu Ricard earned a PhD in molecular genetics in 1972, but completely surprised his friends and family by suddenly turning his back on a highly promising scientific career in order to join a faraway Buddhist monastery. Professor Ricard would eventually go on to serve as the French interpreter for the Dalai Lama, up until the time he became one of the primary designers of the 12-year investigation into the long-term effects mindfulness meditation imparts on the human brain. And, as things turned out, one of the most widely read quotes from the project's lead organizer offered a fascinating insight into the completely unexpected results that emerged after Mathieu Ricard allowed his own brain to be examined, because the scan showed excessive activity in his brain's left prefrontal cortex, allowing him an abnormally large capacity for happiness and a reduced propensity towards negativity. The scans also showed that when meditating on compassion, Ricard's brain produced a level of gamma waves, those linked to consciousness, attention, learning, and memory, never reported before in the literature of neuroscience. Now, the second, but by far most important turning point grew out of the realization that the far-flung circuits typically set into motion by pain or seeing others in pain operated at an altogether higher octave in long-time meditators, because the very same areas traditionally associated with the deepest levels of inborn motherly love also turned out to be closely associated with the highest form of heartfelt compassion that completely overwhelms the entire personality, with the most powerful expressions of unconditional loving kindness that carry no other consideration beyond an unrestrained readiness to serve others. And we can also see the final full blossoming of the sweetest fruit in the evolutionary garden being so skillfully captured by the masterful depiction of Saint Teresa as she joyfully receives the heavenly wound that inflames the soul with the love of God. Now, the amazingly consistent descriptions of this profound mystical experience have been meticulously detailed throughout the sacred literature of every great tradition. But mainstream researchers generally ignore this vitally important phase of the human experience until recent technological breakthroughs forced the academic world to begin a serious examination of the newly emerging neuroscience of religious experience. Whereas the latest generation of research literature currently associates this dramatic class of mystical encounter with the notion of an amygdala hijack, whose most common expressions have typically been associated with the powerful release of adrenal hormones that temporarily short-circuit the capacity for rational thinking in the very unusual ways that causes its victims to act out inappropriately. While it is also equally important to point out that all limbic hijackings are not distressing, because their positive expressions have frequently been associated with profound instances of deep religious experience, as well as self-sacrificing heroic acts of the highest order. Which may also explain why the most famous artistic depictions of Saints Teresa and Augustine both exhibit radiating crowns flaring out over the green-colored areas most closely associated with the brain's visual processing centers, because the traditional equivalents to the amygdala hijack all detail an overwhelming sense of mental and emotional disorientation experienced by the devotees of every faith who suddenly become entranced into the pronounced state of spellbound ecstasy that appeared to completely overwhelm the most famous member of the Carmelite religious order after the living presence of the Holy Spirit suddenly appeared from out of the midst of a slightly elevated cloud hovering just above her private prayer altar, while the fiery flame flaring out over her brain's visual centers would strongly suggest the creator of the portrait is desperately attempting to symbolically describe a powerful religious experience taking place deep inside the inspired heart of the great Christian saint. And as a matter of fact, the further we go along, the more we come to realize there is no fundamentally essential difference between the ancient Buddhist teachings on the Great Compassion, Catholic devotions to the Sacred Heart, the Islamic practice of dhikr, or the Hasidic Jewish ideal regarding the highest expressions of loving kindness, where the soul catches fire and is itself turned into flame in the exact same way that was represented by the famous portrait of St. Augustine in his study, as well as by the legendary 6-ton depiction of the Golden Buddha, who has become completely absorbed into the highest state of divine oneness with the heavenly flame. While interestingly enough, the ancient Greek name for the earthly goddess of driving forces eventually came to be associated with the physical hormones during the earliest decades of the 20th century, shortly after the powerful role they played in driving the body's internal activities came to be recognized. And so here once again, we have the traditional Sufi term for the ecstatic joy of the blissful inner vision, literally translating to describe the notion of becoming intoxicated with God, which certainly appears to have been the case in the classic depiction of the most towering figure in the history of the Catholic Church, who appears to have become so completely distracted by the fiery presence of the heavenly truth, he was not even aware of the vitally important books and scrolls being crushed under the sole of his feet. So at the end of the day, the basic components making up the Co-op 21 coursework have all been weaved together into a seamless interactive gestalt that combines the best and most effective mainstream interventions together with an open-minded appreciation for the latest generation of so-called alternative options, with the ultimate long-term goal of consciously channeling the pronounced healing synergy that would inevitably emerge out from the carefully planned, medically supervised application of one, an extended regimen of intermittent water-only fasting interventions, practice in direct combination with two, the long-term adoption of whole food, plant-based diet therapies, the carefully measured integration of desuggestive learning, deep immersion meditation, and fMRI technology into the tenaciously all-out effort to fully develop the healthy, happy, and morally advanced personality type the original founder of Harvard University School of Sociology once referred to as a living and breathing power station of love. And so, we will close out this workshop series with the inspiring words from the legendary 19th century innovator whose constant comparison of small growing children with beautifully manicured flourishing gardens finally led him to formally establish the Children's Education Garden, better known today as the Early Learning Kindergarten, that currently makes up the most basic foundation stone of the modern public school system. In all things, there lives and reigns an eternal law. This all-controlling law is based on an all-pervading, energetic, living, self-conscious, and hence eternal unity. And this unity is God. It is the destiny and life work of all things to unfold their essence and to reveal God in their external and transient being. Education consists in leading the soul as a thinking, intelligent being, growing into consciousness toward the inner law of divine unity, and in teaching the ways and means thereto. Education should lead to peace with nature and to unity with God.
I was a product of the 60s, and I had a very idealistic view of wanting to change the world, and I still do.
Richard Davidson is a well-renowned neuroscientist, but I think of him as an explorer, mapping our brain's incredible possibilities and leading the way to a deeper scientific understanding of everything from memories to happiness.
I had an intuition that the human mind was kind of the next scientific frontier, and that if there were some way to cultivate more positive minds, we can change the world for the better. I began with most of my focus on the negative side of things. And then when I met the Dalai Lama in 1992, he asked me, why have you been using the tools of modern neuroscience just to study anxiety and stress and fear and depression? Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And it was like, whoa, just a total wake-up call for me. And that is, in fact, what we've been doing since that critical moment. One of the first ways in which we decided to begin was something that His Holiness encouraged us to do, which is to test individuals who spent years training their mind. These people have spent, on average, about 34,000 hours of lifetime practice. And so in that particular experiment, we were looking for signs in brain electrical signals to ascertain whether those signals, when individuals are actually meditating, showed anything unusual. And what we found was remarkable. Gamma is a brain rhythm that is occurring at roughly 40 cycles per second. And in the brains of the advanced Tibetan meditators, we found the presence of these gamma oscillations that went on for tens of minutes, and they were very high amplitude. The brains were also significantly different when they weren't meditating. And these differences reflect the enduring traces, if you will. And it gives us some clue that, in fact, the baseline state of these individuals is transformed as a consequence of their practice. Around here, we talk about healthy minds and well-being as skills. All of the scientific research is leading inevitably to this conclusion. These simple, ancient practices that were developed 2,500 years ago are now being tracked with instruments that have just become available in human history for the first time. We use MRI to analyze the structure of the brain, the function of the brain. We can actually see changes in subtle blood flow to different regions of the brain. And so there is undeniable evidence that practices to cultivate well-being influence the functioning of the brain. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly. The invitation in all of this work is that we can actually take more responsibility for the shaping of our own brains by engaging in healthy habits of mind. One of the important constituents of well-being we call resilience. We could actually track the brain circuits that are responsible for this. We have shown that we can actually influence these brain circuits through training. And we can take someone who was not so resilient and improve their resilience. And they actually show improvements in their well-being. I think that one of the important insights from our work is that the mind can be transformed, that we all are born with a capability for change, and that the seeds of living a life that is compassionate, that's kind, that's generous, is within each of us. And if we all believe that, I am absolutely convinced the world would be a much better and happier place.